Hello, welcome to another very special CleaveTech tech tip today. And it's that time of year where we're getting very close to giving all of our newcomers and least experienced racers a chance to race on the Nationals track amongst themselves and have their own national championship. They'll be racing for the 2025 BSCRA Mid-America Clubman Nationals. Now last year I did a whole series of videos about the Clubman Nationals and we built a car, and I'm going to do something very similar this year. If you haven't seen my videos, I'll put a link in the top corner there for you to click on and you can see what we did last year. But this year the whole thing has been sponsored by Mid-America products. I've tried to lay out in this opening screen all the parts that we've got to build this car. Now this is the INTRO32 class and it's our premier event at the Clubman Nationals. And like we did last year, I'm going to be building a car and we raffle it off and then someone could actually win this car and use it at the event. If you're in the UK, you can go on the Mid-America Products website, which is slotcarstore.uk, or if you're rest of the world or particularly in America, it's slotcarstore.net. And you can order all these parts through there, or you can order them all through your raceway to support your local raceway, especially if you're in the United States. So I'm going to get on with the build and show you some tips and tricks along the way to make sure that the car goes together and performs the best it can on the track. So let's start with the chassis. We have a BSCRA Genesis chassis. Now these were designed and they're manufactured by a guy called Richard Mack here in the UK. He was a jeweller by trade and did some really fancy stuff. So his workmanship is excellent. And on the bottom of the chassis, don't know whether you can quite see it, but we do have it engraved with BSCRA Genesis on the chassis there. Now this chassis is designed for an FK type motor and we're going to be putting the Mid-America Eagle. There are only a couple of motors really that people will be using in this series that are eligible, and they are the Mid-America Eagle, which is the Mid 605, or you can run a JK Hawk 7, and most people choose the double bull raced version of those these days. So the motor is designed to screw in, but first of all, before we do anything else with the chassis, we're going to just round off some of the leading edges of the chassis so as to protect the track so that there are no sharp edges here when the car runs onto the track. And I've got a nice little trick tool that allows us to round off some of the bits that are quite hard to get to. So this is the only chassis that's allowed in this class. It is a one chassis class. And the chassis, as I say, come pre-assembled. But we can obviously build them up into a complete car and make sure they're not going to damage the track. So I've got this little trick tool here in my Proxon. Here it is. I'll put a link of where you can get all these things from in the description below the video so you can see where you can buy all these. But as you can see, I've used it a little bit before, but it's a very small, like grinding, it's a rubber, it's got diamond dust impregnated into the rubber and it acts as a very small sort of grinding tool. And it's really useful for getting into the chassis here where you can't take them apart, and you can round off any leading edges that are really hard to get to. So I'm going to be giving that a go now. Now if I bring that in close, can you see how I've gone along and I've managed to just radius that leading edge there to stop the pan from having any sharp edges and catching the track. So I'm going to do that on the other little bits here and around the front here that are quite hard to get to without having to take the chassis apart.
A few moments later.
And there we have it. I've done all the difficult to get to bits. So we've gone the front of the pans here, the front behind the guide, and I've also done the two back edges. You can see this bit here. That's obviously a little mark there from the laser cutting. It's a little blip that's sticking out. I'm going to see if I can clean that up anymore to get rid of that little blip. It's not hurting anything because the pans don't move. The chassis is sort of all interlocked together as it's sort of cut all in one piece. But I want to try and get rid of that just because I don't like it. And there we have it, it's gone. I used a really thin cut-off disc and just very carefully got in there. It was literally only a tiny little bit just on the surface or right on the very corner, so I was able to get rid of that nice and easily. And you can see now that we've got all those rounded off. So I'm going to continue to round off the other edges just with a grinding disc on my Dremel, and then polish the edges a little bit so they're nice and shiny. So I've just used that cutting disc just to radius off the leading edges of the chassis, just a tiny bit, just to make sure that when the tyres come down on the car and you're running it quite low, or when you fall off the track and the car's at a slightly different angle, it doesn't dig in and damage the track. So the next thing, I'm just going to polish up those edges with one of these little polishing wheels here. Again, all the links for where you can get these tools are down below in the video description. So there we have it, all the edges rounded and polished off, so there's no sharp edges on the bottom of the chassis anymore, and that should slide nicely over the track without causing any damage. So next up is to see how flat is this chassis. So get yourself a really nice granite surface block like this. Again, I'll put a link below of where you can get it from. And obviously with a really nice flat block, you can check the chassis all over and do my usual technique of just sort of tapping on the top of the chassis, pushing down on it, seeing if you can see anything moving in any of those areas. Now, this one's actually really good from the packet. They're not bad at all, because obviously they're made from a flat sheet of metal in the first place. They're not folded like a typical 1/24 production chassis. So they're actually soldered together by Richard, and he does a really nice job. But sometimes, just with the heat and the soldering, sometimes they can sort of bend a little bit just on these two ears here and here, and sometimes the little bits that stick out that hold the pillar blocks, they tend to bend a little bit. So it's always worth checking, is it sitting the way it should? And this one's really good. You can see here, there's a little bit of movement there of this long bit here sticking out that's slightly too high and bent up. But actually, bent up is better than bent down, really, because if it's bent down, then it limits your ground clearance you can have on the chassis, and it also digs into the track more. So if anything, you do want a very slight bend up on these two rear ends here, where the back of the pans rest down on these two supports here. So I'm going to give this a tiny little tweak. Again, you could probably do it with your hands, but I have a really nice set of pliers that I use. Show you like these ones, these flat nose pliers here. These are really nice, they're really thin at the end, and I'm going to use those to grab the chassis and just give it a tiny little tweak and flatten it off. And there we go, I'm happy now. Press this, nothing happens. That side, nothing happens. And I'm pressing here just in case I bent it too much. And then this bit was up in the air, but it's not. It's looking good at the moment. There's no movement of the chassis. So that was the worst part. It's also worth just checking across the front, because sometimes when this lead wire and guide tab retainer gets soldered in, the front tends to curve up a little bit. But that all looks good too. And do the pans sit nicely? Is there any movement on the pans? No, we're looking good. Also, if I were to lift the center section up whilst holding the pans, so I'm holding the pans here and lifting that center section, or if I slide it towards the edge, if I lift each one of these, do these little pan stops, are they pressing down on the rest of the chassis? And yes, they are. There's no movement up here. I wouldn't expect a lot of upwards movement there. So they all look good. Check the back end. Is the back end the same? Hold the pans down, push up. Yes, so these pan stops are definitely doing their job, and the pans aren't dropping below the center section at all. So I'm quite happy that that one is actually really nice and flat and straight and didn't take a lot of work. So next up, I'm going to install the rear axle bushes. So I've got my Mid-America here, axle bushes, mid 550. I've got an axle, because I'm going to need the axle to align it properly. And I've got a gear, and I'll show you why I've got the gear in a moment. And these two axle blocks here, axle jig blocks. Now these are ones that I've got, and I've got a few of them left for sale now. I had some more made because they were really popular last time I used these in a video. So these axle jig blocks here will allow me to get perfect axle height both sides. So why have I got the gear? Well, again, this is a standard gear ratio that has to be used in this class. It is 1137 64 pitch, and we have to use an angled 16-degree angled 64 pitch gear. Now, if I were to measure the diameter of this gear, it comes out at around about 610 for its diameter. Now, you are allowed to take the tips off a little bit of here, and you can see that the holes in the chassis are just round holes. They're not elongated. So the idea is that you're not messing around with the wheelbase or axle height too much from the standard chassis. But we are allowed to at least get the axle nice and straight and true and the same height both sides. So if you look very closely here, in that hole there, in that pillar block, there is a very slight burr on the inside of the hole. And when I tried to push the oilite into that hole, it just caught on that burr. So I'm just going to clean that little burr off. Now I have some little round diamond bits that are ideal for that task. Now here it is. You can see it's quite well used. Use it quite a lot, obviously. And I'm just going to put that in my Dremel, run it round the inside of the hole and clean off that burr.
12 seconds later.
So there we have it. Burr's gone from inside there. Now, whilst I was at it, I had a look at the other pillar block and noticed, oh, that's a shame. The other pillar block is not quite soldered in square to the chassis. If I were to put a straight edge on that, you can see in there that it's not quite vertical. This side is very good. That side sits fine. But the other side is not quite vertical. So I'm going to have to reflow the solder around this pillar block and straighten it up before I put the bushes in place. So I've given it a little bit of a reflow with the solder, and I think I'm happy that I've straightened that up to be a lot more like where it should be, a lot more vertical. So now with the pillar blocks both sitting nice and vertical, I've put the axle through, I've put the bushes in place, and I've used these little old centres off of gears just to hold the bushes in place in between the pillar blocks. You see with a tiny bit of movement. They're not that tight. There is a fraction of a movement of those bushes in these holes, but I'm going to solder them in and set them up right. Now, you're asking, well, why did I measure the gear? Well, I measured the gear to work out what size I needed to jig up the axle so that it worked with that gear. Now, as I said, we're allowed to take the tips of the gear off a fraction. So I'm going to use a 300 spacing on my jig to set up the axle height. So each one of these blocks, I put the 300 towards the bottom and then push it on, 300 towards the bottom and push it on. And then I'm going to very lightly tack the bushes in place and then measure and check everything. So it's always sensible to put a little bit of oil on the axle, just in case you slip with your soldering iron. You don't really want to solder the bushes to the axle, so I can do that. I'm going to put a tiny bit of flux, and I use Lucky Bob's flux. So just put a little bit on that one and a little bit on that one. These little flux brushes are brilliant. Again, I'll put a link in the description below where you can get those. And a little bit of solder on the end of the iron. Make sure everything's sitting as I want it to be sitting. And then just a little tack at the back there on one side and tack it on the back on the other side. There we go. And then I can take it apart or take the blocks off and I can measure and make sure everything's sitting as I want it to before I finish. Okay, so let's just check the length on both sides. So I can put the calipers on there, so I get 95.84, and this side 95.83. So I'm pretty happy. That's within my tolerance. I would say 0.1 of a millimetre would be sensible to get your axle nice and straight both sides. So now that I'm happy that everything is straight, I'm just going to flow a little bit more solder around these bushes, but obviously not too much so I move anything. So I need to keep everything in place when I'm soldering a little bit more around those bushes. And then a double check once more. Has anything moved, or am I still happy with it? Exactly the same both sides. Now before I clean it all up, I'm going to flow a little bit more solder just into these front pan joints here, because when Richard builds them, he solders the pin tubes in, or the pin tube mounts in, and lets the solder flow either side of that, but he doesn't let the solder all the way down here. Obviously, if he was soldering everything, even more, he'd have to charge a bit more for the chassis, but he's trying to do it on a bit of a budget to keep things a little, costs down for the racers. So I'm going to very carefully flow a little bit more solder under these two pan hinges here, or pan stops, like that. Put a bit of flux on and then flow very carefully. It doesn't take a lot, but I'm going to hold them down and flow a bit more solder in like this.
A few moments later.
So there we have it. I've given everything a good wash and a good scrub, and you can see that I've soldered around those rear axle bushes nice and solidly, so they're not going anywhere. Now you can see I've cleaned up these two solder joints here, and the reason why I soldered those is just to stop the inside of the pans from hanging down when it's on the track. So I think that makes it a little bit more solid just there. I did also flow some more solder around the guide tab as well, because in the past I have found that when Richard solders those, he's a bit minimal with his solder. It's really neat, but he does use a little bit less solder than I would use in some places. And you can see it looks a little bit shinier now. Well, that's because I've used this stuff, AutoSol Metal Polish. Again, I'll put a link down below where you can get it from. I literally, when I'm cleaning my chassis, I just take an old toothbrush, something like this, maybe not your best toothbrush, maybe not the wife's toothbrush or your partner's toothbrush, but an old toothbrush, and then give it a good scrub with some AutoSol, and then wash it off just in soapy water afterwards, and then dry it. And again, I've shown this in one of my things before, one of these X-Power dryers, little blower, they're really good. And again, I'll put a link of where you can get one down below. So if you're wondering what all that crashing was and the noise in the background in some of this video, well, at CleaveTech Towers, there's lots of things going on. It is a busy environment. I'm not just here on my own. So I think we're going to leave it like that for today, in today's video. And then you can join us again next time, where we'll start putting some of the ancillaries and other bits and pieces on this chassis. So until then, I'll say goodbye. Keep subscribing, hit the thumbs up please if you like the video, and then it will push it out to more people who like slot car racing too. See you again soon. Bye.